Before we begin, if you enjoy falling asleep to forgotten corners of history, quiet stories of queens, cloisters, and curious customs bring you peace, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments below, what time is it where you are? Where are you listening from tonight? We read everyone. Can you're part of this quiet, curious little world now? Let's begin. Asterisk. In the heavy heat of ancient Rome, in a time when public silence was a virtue and private grief a spectacle, there was a law so obscure, so delicate, that even those who enforced it often whispered its name. It wasn't about land, nor taxes, nor even marriage. It was about a woman's hair, or more precisely, what a widow could or could not do with it in the Roman Republic. Grief was a performance governed by unwritten traditions and enforced by social shame. And nothing spoke more of that grief than a widow's hair. You've likely heard of the toga, the great draped fabric of Rome, but far less discussed, and far more potent in signaling a woman's status was the veil and the state of the hair it was meant to conceal. For married women, hair was bound. For unmarried girls, it was looser, more adorned. But for widows, it was a battleground. A respectable widow was expected to cut her hair short and cover it. Not in a style of quiet mourning that would fade with time, but in a sharp, almost punitive shearing. A visible reminder to the world that her fertility, and perhaps, more disturbingly, her political influence, was now dangerous. Her hair, once symbolic of order and obedience, had become wild, ungoverned, a thing to be restrained in some quarters. This was just etiquette. In others, it was legally enforced. The Lex Apia, for instance, which was first passed in 215 BCE during the Second Punic War, restricted not only a woman's use of luxury items, but also her adornment, a category which explicitly included hair. The law did not name widows directly. Everyone knew who it was aimed at. The death of a husband elevated a Roman woman in a strange way. She was now sui juris, legally independent, longer under the guardianship of a father or spouse. For the wealthy or politically connected, this meant she could own property, sponsor buildings, and most concerning of all to the Senate, influence public opinion. And so her hair became a political symbol. Public mourning rituals demanded a woman display her grief by making herself unappealing, unadorned, and ideally invisible. A widow who failed to cut her hair or refused to wear the mourning veil was not just seen as immodest, she was seen as potentially subversive. There's a story, half legend, half cautionary tale, of a woman named Fulvia, not Fulvia, wife of Mark Antony, but an earlier namesake who lived in the shadowed years after the Gallic sack. Fulvia was widowed young, and rather than retreat into quiet mourning, she chose to keep her hair long, oiled, and visibly uncovered. The Senate noticed, and not kindly. According to later chroniclers, Fulvia began gathering women, other widows, abandoned wives, those on the margins of Rome's rigid respectability, and held gatherings where they discussed politics, not overtly, not publicly, but it was enough. And then came the day she walked past the rostra with her hair uncovered. The reaction was swift. Riot. Some called it protest. Others, a crowd formed. Men shouted. Women wept. The veil had been broken, and with it, the illusion that Rome's social order was immovable. Fulvia vanished from the records soon after. Some say she was exiled. Others suggest she was quietly retired to the countryside, a polite euphemism for imprisonment without trial. But what remained was her hair, or rather, what it represented. The Lex Apia gained renewed enforcement power. Public magistrates began inspecting veils. Stylists were punished for maintaining a widow's long hair. A network of informal informants, mostly elder matrons, began to police the mourning dress of their peers. Grief was no longer private, controlled, and all of this over a widow's choice not to cut her hair. The logic behind such control was both cynical and calculated. In Rome, public image was power. A widow with long hair could still attract suitors, gather influence, even remarry into a political alliance. But one with a shorn head and covered brow, she was harmless, contained, less likely to conspire. Some scholars argue that this was more than misogyny. It was risk management. In the fragile balance of Republican politics, appearance equaled allegiance. A woman in mourning dress was declaring herself loyal to her husband's family, to tradition, to the past. A woman who stepped outside that mold, she might be loyal to something else, a cause, a movement, or worse, to herself. Hair in Rome was memory. It marked you as claimed or unclaimed, as grieved or defiant. And for widows, it was the most fragile thread between power and punishment. But how did this veil of grief evolve into one of rebellion? And what happened in the years that followed Fulvia's quiet disappearance? You can imagine the streets of Rome just after the death of Fulvia's husband. The sun would strike hard against the white stone. The market women shouted prices over the braying of donkeys. Senators moved like shadows between shaded colonnades, their togas rustling like dry parchment. And somewhere, quietly but deliberately, Fulvia stepped outside her home, her hair loose, her brow bare, and her mouth closed. She didn't shout, she didn't petition, but the silence was deafening. The Roman matron, especially a widow, was expected to embody modesty. This was pudictia, a kind of virtuous decorum expressed through posture, tone, and, above all, appearance. Mourning was supposed to be loud only in funerary processions and silent everywhere else. Women were to keep to their homes, to whisper with family, and above all, to look the part. Fulvia didn't. She walked like a question mark through the city in unanswered challenge. Roman law didn't yet know how to define that defiance, but Roman society felt it. And soon, so did its laws. What began as scorn turned quickly into fear. Matrons on the Palatine Hill began complaining, cited Fulvia by name. Others merely said certain women. Soon the rumors shifted. Fulvia was said to host gatherings, not just of widows, but of wives displeased with their husbands. There were whispers of love charms, of hair rituals invoking the manes, the spirits of the dead. Others claimed she refused to take the tunica recta, the plain mourning dress, and instead wore colors. It is unlikely any of that was true, but the accusations themselves were effective. And from that moment, hair became a tool of surveillance. By 213 BCE, 2 years after the Lex Appia was introduced, the censors began asking questions during their 5-year reviews of citizen conduct. Widows were increasingly scrutinized for how long they remained in mourning and how they presented that mourning. Could a widow be seen buying hair oil in the market? Was she permitted to braid her daughter's hair in public? Could she leave her veil down if there were no men present? These were not questions of law. They were questions of loyalty. Because in Rome, the death of a husband did not free a woman entirely. She was expected to remain loyal to her gens, the extended family of her husband, and her mourning performance was how that loyalty was measured. The longer she wore the veil, the deeper the devotion. The sooner she shed it, the more dangerous she became. And then something curious happened. Women began to resist, not through loud rebellion, but through a slow redefinition of grief. Some wore the veil, but used finer fabrics. Others wore short hair, but braided it in ways reminiscent of married women. Quiet, coded language of hair began to emerge in upper-class Roman circles, an unspoken message about power, propriety, and place. There's a remarkable set of funeral inscriptions found outside of Rome in the ancient town of Praeneste that describe widows not only in terms of their family roles, but of their composite crines, their arranged hair. One widow, Vittoria, is noted as sorrowful, yet adorned with dignity. Another, Clodia, is said to have worn mourning that did not dim her face. It's subtle, but telling. These women were remembered not for their silence or invisibility, but for how they carried grief as a visible, composed act, not a disfigurement. But not all Romans found this acceptable. By the mid-2nd century BCE, satirists like Lucilius began mocking what they called the luxuria lugentium, the luxury of mourners. He described women weeping behind veils of silk and parading grief like a costume. The implication was clear. Mourning had become performative, and worse, strategic. It wasn't just about hair anymore. It was about optics. You see, in Rome, a widow could become very powerful, especially if she remained unmarried. If her husband had died with a will, she could control property. If he had military command, she could retain access to networks of loyal clients. If he had no male heir, she could be the steward of his legacy, shaping how he was remembered. A politically astute widow might sponsor games in his honor, or build monuments, or even engage in quiet diplomacy through social gatherings. And what did all of this look like to an average Roman walking by? A woman in black, with her veil pinned just so, her hair just short enough to be proper, but not so short that it looked monkish, her eyes downcast, but always watching, her silence a kind of speech. It's no wonder that Roman lawmakers feared the symbolic power of hair. They couldn't legislate grief, but they could legislate its display. In 195 BCE, the Lex Appia was repealed after much public debate, but its echoes remained. Even without the legal force, the expectations around mourning persisted. And the mourning veil, once a mere social custom, took on an aura of civic virtue. Yet, despite the repeal, enforcement didn't disappear. The censorial reviews continued. Scorn and satire replaced prosecution, and for every fovea who vanished, there were 10 others who adapted, bending the rules just enough to remain visible, but not vulnerable. And so Roman society reached a strange equilibrium. Widows learned to navigate a narrow path, one where their hair spoke volumes without ever moving, one where veils could hide more than faces. They could hide intentions, networks, allegiances. The Senate never passed another direct law on widows' mourning attire, but city ordinances, temple expectations, and household codes filled in the silence. Rome became a place where grief was measured, not in tears, but in inches of hair. And still, the question lingered. If a widow's hair could start a riot, what else could it do? Asterisk, the riot wasn't large by Roman standards. Not like the Great Bread protests or the stampedes outside the gladiatorial games. It didn't involve swords or fire or even a formal decree. But for those who lived near the Forum that day, it felt like something far more dangerous, a quiet rupture in Rome's most sacred order. Appearance. The morning began with no omen, no bird call from a rooftop auger, tremor in the cobbled stones, just a widow walking across the Forum unaccompanied, her veil pushed back, her hair left long. It wasn't Fovea. Her name had already slipped into rumor by then, but another woman, young, veiled in black fabric, too sheer to be modest, and behind her, a slow procession of other women, some old, some defiant, all silent. They passed the Basilica Aemilia, walked under the shadow of the temple of Castor and Pollux, and finally paused before the rostra, the speaking platform where orators once called for war and peace. No one spoke, no slogans, no chants, just women in public, unveiling mourning like it was a kind of resistance. At first, onlookers watched in confusion. Then came murmurs. And then, from the edge of the crowd, a man, likely a market official, barked that they were causing disruption, that this was indecent, that grief was not a public theater. Someone threw a piece of spoiled fruit. Someone else grabbed a veil and yanked it down. But the widow who had led them, her name lost to the footnotes of history, simply stood still. That's when the crowd surged. It never became an all-out brawl. Roman security forces, urban cohorts, or perhaps local lictors stepped in fast enough, but the damage had been done, not to property, but to Rome's illusion of control. Because now the city had seen it. Grief, not as submission, but as statement. By sundown, the Senate convened an emergency session, not because they feared another riot. The city had seen worse, but because of what that moment implied. If widows, who were supposed to be apolitical, private, and docile, could challenge public norms, who else might follow? The response was careful. There were no new laws, no mass arrests. Instead, temple authorities issued clarifications. Mourning rites must be observed with appropriate modesty. Households were instructed to conduct all commemorative rituals indoors. Hairdressers caught assisting with improper styles were fined or quietly blacklisted. And a new cohort of female informants, elderly, well-connected, loyal to the senatorial class, were given authority to report unpatriotic mourning. These matronal enforcers were never given a name in the official records, but in private letters of the period. They are called the Dominae Umbri, the ladies of the shade. Their role was simple: observe, correct, and when needed, silence. Not with violence, but with shame. A whispered judgment here, a social snub there, a subtle pressure that ensured no woman forgot what mourning was supposed to look like. And through it all, the hair remained the battleground. There are accounts, scattered through the works of Plutarch and Suetonius, of women fined for excessive mourning attire, of public lectures on the dangers of a widow's seductive grief. Even plays were written mocking the malairs discolorated, the improperly darkened women, satirical jab at widows who failed to mourn with enough visual austerity. Yet, beneath the satire was real fear, because Roman men knew something they didn't like to say loud. The widow was the only Roman woman who could speak freely, own property outright, and sponsor public works in her own name. A wealthy widow was not a relic of the past. She was a potential political player. Her hair, her veil, her silence, all could be tools, or threats. And so, a strange compromise emerged. Public mourning rituals became more theatrical, not less. Veils grew longer, processions more elaborate, but behind closed doors, the rules began to loosen. Wealthy households hosted private mourning salons. Hair was grown longer under wigs. Some women commissioned marble reliefs depicting themselves with uncovered hair, a quiet nod to autonomy that could be dismissed as art. Even tombs began to reflect this shift. In the catacombs of Priscilla, you can still see depictions of Christian widows, not veiled and shorn, but upright arms raised, hair stylized in ways that echo both mourning and majesty. They were no longer simply grieving. They were remembered, and in a society where memory was power, that mattered. Fulvia and those like her may have disappeared from the official histories, but their resistance survived, not in law, but in custom. It's not in rebellion, but in ritual. The very act of mourning became a language, a form of soft politics, a way to say, I grieve, but I remain. And in the centuries that followed, as Rome shifted from republic to empire and then to dust, that language never fully faded. You see it in medieval mourning hoods, Victorian, locks of hair kept in brooches, in veils worn at funerals to this day. Symbols of grief and of quiet endurance. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing a widow could do was refuse to disappear. Asterisk, long before the sweeping deserts of Yemen were carved by empire and foreign war, they were ruled by something far stranger. Women who wore their power in silence, not in speech, and whose hair was more than personal adornment. It was prophecy. It was defiance. It was law. Among them, no name lingered quite like that of Arwa al-Salehi, the veiled queen who ruled from behind a curtain, yet whose shadow stretched across mountains, mosques, and the memory of a dynasty. Her beginnings were quiet. Born in the early 11th century in the highlands of Yemen, Arwa entered a world where girls were expected to learn the recitations of the Quran, proceed into marriage, and remain obedient behind walls. Her family was well placed in the growing Zulayhide dynasty, loyal to the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, which, at the time, was carving a Shia foothold across a largely Sunni Arab landscape. But Arwa's destiny wasn't shaped in the palace courts. It was shaped in mourning when she was still a teenager. Arwa was married to Al-Mukarram Ahmad, the son of Yemen's ruling sultan. The match was political part alliance, part inheritance. But the real power in the kingdom was her mother-in-law, Queen Asma bint Shihab, who ruled in public without a male regent. She spoke from the minbar, the pulpit of the mosque, where only men were ever allowed to speak. She ruled from court without a veil, issuing decrees in her own name. Haiba, her hair covered but her mind exposed. This was more than an education. It was a warning, because Asma was both admired and reviled. Her name was etched in coins and whispered in curses. She was called the Veilless One, not because she refused the veil, but because she saw no need to hide her power. And when Asma grew old and her son fell ill, all eyes turned to Arwa. She was young, observant, thoughtful, and silent. But that silence hid something dangerous, a wheel sharpened by grief, politics, and the steady unraveling of the dynasty around her. In 1067, after Asma's death, and with Al-Mukarram too sick to rule, Arwa was named regent. At first, she ruled on behalf of her husband, Ken, then of her son. But within a few years, something unprecedented happened. Caliph in Cairo declared her Hujah, the spiritual and political leader of the Ismaili Shia in Yemen. Woman, given full ruling authority, she did not remove her veil. She did not hold court in the open. Instead, Arwa ruled from behind a curtain. She gave orders through intermediaries. Her face remained hidden, her tone soft, her letters signed with the mark of divine blessing. But her hair, though never seen, became the subject of gossip, poetry, and fear, because in Yemeni custom, a ruler's hair was a sign of purity and legitimacy. Queens, unlike their male counterparts, were not crowned. They were adorned. Their braids were ritually washed, scented, and woven with strings of red and saffron before major decrees were issued. The ceremony was performed in private, but its echoes shaped policy. And Arwa, though she never let the public see her braids, kept them long. Long hair in this context was not vanity. It was lineage. It suggested she had nothing to hide, that no male hand had cut her authority short. Even her political enemies, who accused her of overreaching, teed so by questioning whether her braids were still being ritually blessed, not whether her policies were effective. One chronicler from the time, a scholar named Idris al-Yamani, writes that the court waited not for her voice, but the scent of her hair. It's a strange sentence, or revealing. You see, Arwa's rule was marked by sharp military decisions, economic reforms, and architectural projects that reshaped the city of Jibla, turning it into a mountain capital of elegance and iron control. She built mosques. She negotiated trade routes, commissioned gardens and granaries that saved thousands during famine years. But her real weapon was perception. By remaining veiled, she became what her enemies couldn't attack, an idea when rival tribes questioned her leadership. She reminded them not of her lineage, but of her braids, that they were uncut, untouched, unpolluted, that they had passed through Asma's hands, that they had been anointed under the authority of the Fatimid Caliph, in a ritual whispered through silk and smoke. Her enemies didn't laugh, they bowed. The symbolism may seem strange now, but at the time, hair was both spiritual and judicial. In some tribal courts, a woman's braid could be presented as proof of claim, a physical bond of trust. To cut a woman's hair in anger was more than insult. It was exile. It stripped her of her social value, so Arwa guarded hers. When rumors surfaced that her advisors had plotted a coup, aiming to install her young cousin in her place, the response was swift. The plotters vanished. Their names were scratched out from records. And in the weekly sermons that followed, the imam made mention of a braid unbroken by betrayal. Not a head unbowed, not a sword unraised, a braid. And so Arwa ruled for over 50 years through revolts, plagues, dynastic feuds, and religious wars. She sat behind her curtain in the palace of Gibla. Her face remained hidden. Her power did not. Pilgrims came from afar to bring her petitions. She answered in letters dipped in perfume and sealed in wax, and though her voice was never heard in the streets, her silence ruled the land. But behind the soft power, there was still, because Arwa was not merely ceremonial, but necessary. She ordered executions. She withdrew military support from rival governors. She sanctioned trade embargoes and sent secret missives to the Fatimids in Egypt, sometimes opposing their decisions. Her hair was legend, her mind sharper still, and yet history nearly forgot her. Most Arab chroniclers after the 12th century barely mention her. The Ottoman-era historians erase her entirely. Her palace in Gibla still stands, but few know the name of the woman who ruled there longer than most kings. Why? Perhaps because she refused to fit the mold. She was neither the unveiled rebel, like Ozma, nor the passive consort. She governed in silence, in scent, in ritual, a power expressed through invisible strands, not declarations. Or, perhaps, because her story was too dangerous to retell. Because if a queen could rule with nothing but the memory of a braid, what else might women remember? Asterisk, the city of Gibla, where Queen Arwa built her quiet capital, rises like a crown above the highlands of Yemen, all narrow alleys, stacked stone houses, and the scent of cardamom drifting from kitchens that have barely changed since her time. Even now, centuries later, the old mosque she commissioned still whispers her name in Friday prayers. But in her own lifetime, Ar rarely allowed her name to be spoken aloud in public. Instead, she ruled through symbols, and none more potent than her hidden braid, never shown, never cut, and yet as powerful as any decree by the time she had ruled for over a decade. Arwa had become more than just queen. She was known as Sayyidat Ahura, the noble lady who was free. Not free in the modern sense, but free of male guardianship, free of being treated like an ornament, free of the rule that confined most women to the domestic sphere. But her freedom had limits, ones she navigated with remarkable precision. Her court was a paradox of power and modesty. Men ruled in her name, but everyone knew the decisions came from behind the curtain. She signed orders in neat Kufic script. She consulted religious scholars privately, then issued binding rulings. Foreign ambassadors arrived expecting a veiled figurehead and left realizing they'd spoken to a shadow more authoritative than most sultans. And yet, her public image never strayed from mourning modesty. She dressed always in dark robes. Her veil was long, sometimes scented with myrrh, sometimes left plain, but always worn. Her braids, according to court accounts, were washed ritually every full moon by the same handmaidens who had once served Queen Ozma. It was an old custom, but one she maintained with deliberate care, a private ritual turned public reassurance. Because in a society where most rulers declared power with armies or banners, Ar declared it with continuity. The braid became a covenant, a signal that she was still loyal to the Sulahide line, still in communion with the Fatimid cause, and still unshaken by factional unrest. When tribal leaders hesitated, she would remind them through a sealed letter or a whispered audience that her braid had not been cut, her mourning not yet ended, and her authority not yet relinquished, and they listened, partly because of tradition, partly because of fear, but mostly because Arwa's rule worked. She restored irrigation systems across the Yemeni highlands, reviving farmland during one of the worst drought cycles in the region's history. She expanded trade routes through the port of Aden, cleverly navigating the tensions between Egyptian authority and local tribal politics. And when rebel governors in the south attempted to assert autonomy, she withdrew grain shipments and waited until they came crawling back to her court. Always, her responses were measured, never rash. Her public silence was misread by many foreign observers as submission, but her actions told another story, one of precise, intentional control. And yet, power breeds jealousy. By the 1080s, a new generation of tribal leaders in Yemen, raised with tales of warriors and swords, not braids and veils, began to question Arwa's continued rule. They accused her of hiding behind custom, stalling royal succession, of manipulating the Fatimid court in Egypt through religious ceremony rather than legal right. The most vocal among them was a governor named Ibrahim ibn Najah, who publicly declared that Arwa's rule had expired with her husband's death, that her long mourning was a theatrical excuse to cling to power, that the braid, once a sacred symbol, had become a political farce. It was a dangerous accusation, because in Yemen, to publicly question the sanctity of a ruler's mourning was to accuse them of falsifying piety, an offense close to apostasy. But Arwa did not respond with fury. She responded with poetry. Her court issued a series of odes, formally anonymous, but unmistakably written under her guidance, that recast the image of the braid as divine trust. One line, still cited in Sufi circles, reads, "I do not rule with steel or smoke. I rule by the braid that God has left unbroken." The poems traveled fast, even into the souks of distant villages. They were recited in mosques, copied into ledgers, and painted in the margins of Quranic manuscripts. In them, Arwa's veil was no longer just modesty, it was shield. Her hair no longer just a private ritual, but proof of divine favor. Ibrahim ibn Najah backed down, not because he had been defeated militarily, but because he had been outmaneuvered in public imagination. To question Arwa now was to risk blasphemy, not just rebellion. And so, her legend grew. By 1090, Arwa had outlived her husband, most of her rivals, and even the original Fatimid Caliph who appointed her. She was older now, her court smaller, her letters shorter, but her braids, according to visitors, remained untouched. One curious account comes from an Andalusian traveler named Abu Salih, who wrote that in the year 1097 he was invited to a royal audience at Qibla. He never saw Arwa's face till he was handed a silken pouch before leaving a gift. It was said, from the queen herself. Inside was a single strand of dark hair, perfumed and tied in red thread. He didn't understand the gesture. He wrote in his journal, "Perhaps this is a relic, or a challenge," but we understand it now in the context of her world, that hair was both a relic of rule, a reminder that her power was still real, still uncut, and a challenge too. Those who believed a woman must raise her voice to make history. Arwa never shouted. She whispered, and the entire highlands of Yemen bent to listen. But as she aged, a new challenge emerged. One not of rebellion or governance, but succession. Because Arwa had no surviving sons, without a male heir, her dynasty, for all its careful rituals and perfumed letters, faced extinction. So, it's what happens when a woman whose rule was built on unbroken braids must decide whether to let it all unravel. Asterisk by the early 12th century. Queen Arwa had become a myth, wrapped in a veil, no longer just a ruler, but a living relic. In the mountain city of Qibla, children were told to walk softly near her palace walls. Traders lowered their voices when, speaking of her, imams in distant mosques quoted her judgments as though they came from scripture. And yet, inside the quiet stone chambers of her palace, a decision loomed that no prayer or poetry could delay. Arwa was aging, and she had no male heir to her husband. Karam Ahmad had died decades earlier. The children they had once hoped would continue the Salayid line had either perished in infancy or vanished from the record, possibly sent away, possibly passed over. Whatever the truth, Arwa stood at the peak of her reign, utterly alone in blood. The dynasty she had upheld through ritualized silence, and absolute competence stood on the edge of extinction. And in that moment, a strange paradox took root. For all her symbolic strength, the untouched braid, the perfumed veil, the unseen but all-seeing voice, Arwa's power was also her cage. Entire rule had rested on tradition, that she ruled on behalf of her husband, then her son, then in his memory. But now, without a successor, she was forced to ask a terrifying question. Could a queen name a queen? Not in Yemen, not in the Fatimid Creed, not openly. And so, Arwa did what she had always done. She reached for symbols. She began the slow, meticulous process of transferring administrative power not to a child, nor a husband, nor even a general, but to alliances. Trusted tribal leaders, loyal governors, scholars she had quietly elevated over the decades. And in doing so, she created a web of loyalty so intricate that even without a named heir, the kingdom would hold dot, or so she hoped. The first cracks appeared not in Jibla. A distant cousin of the Sulayhid line declared himself rightful successor, backed by merchants and tribal leaders who saw Arwa's silence as a sign of fading power. He was careful not to name her, careful not to curse her. Instead, he praised her, while positioning himself as her inevitable conclusion. Arwa did not retaliate, but weeks later, grain shipments from the highlands stopped flowing to Arden. Soon after, a wave of letters arrived, not signed by Arwa herself, but stamped with her seal, referencing rulings and alliances going back 3 decades. Each letter was addressed to a different faction in the port: merchants, guardsmen, scholars, tribal elders. Each carried a promise, a memory, quiet threat. The rebellion dissolved without a sword drawn. That was Arwa's genius. She had woven loyalty, not through fear or inheritance, but through accumulated trust. Through 30 years of feeding the hungry during drought, settling disputes without bias, and maintaining just enough distance to seem eternal. Still, she knew the truth. Her days were counted. And so she prepared the kingdom, not for a successor, but for her absence. She summoned architects and scholars to document everything: the irrigation canals, the grain reserves, structure of the tax code. She issued endowments to mosques and schools, ensuring education and prayer would continue even if the throne did not. And then, in one of her final acts, she ordered the construction of her own tomb. It wasn't grand, no towering minarets or lavish mosaics, just a stone chamber beside the mosque she had built decades earlier. Simple, humble, silent, and inside it, carved in austere Kufic script, a single line: "Here lies the braid uncut, the veil unlifted." There is no mention of her titles, no list of achievements, no family tree. It's just the symbols that had carried her through war, famine, and decades of skepticism. The braid, the veil, the silence, and yet her legacy refused to stay quiet. After her death in 1138, the region mourned with an intensity not seen since the fall of the Sulahides' founder. Poets composed laments that compared her braid to the river Zybid, nourishing, endless, and hidden. Scholars debated her theology, not to question her, but to preserve her ideas. Even in Cairo, the Fatimid court issued a rare public acknowledgement, praising the lady whose rule surpassed many men's, though her face was never seen. For generations, women in Gibla left single strands of hair wrapped in cloth at the door of her tomb, not as offerings, but as vows, promises to endure, to govern in silence, to speak through action, to carry weight without spectacle. But her dynasty ended with no heir to claim the Salayid name. Yemen fractured again into tribal rule, foreign influence, and internal struggle. Yet even in the chaos, her memory persisted. Her laws were copied into ledgers by rival rulers. Her mosque remained active. Her irrigation systems fed villages long after her name stopped appearing in official texts. And somewhere in those winding mountain paths, the scent of myrrh still drifts near her tomb. The story of Queen Arwa rarely appears in textbooks. She is not cited in the lists of great monarchs. Her portraits are non-existent. Her speeches were never heard. But perhaps that is exactly what she intended, because some rulers wield power through voice, and others through the braid that is never cut. Asterisk, it always began with the census, not of land, or grain, or livestock, but of widows, in the court of the Mughal Empire. During the mid-17th century, when the imperial seal still glistened on, scrolls of Persian calligraphy and jewel-studded ledgers marked each tax district with obsessive precision. One category of citizens slipped silently into the records: widowed women of reproductive age. Hair uncut, they were counted not for their wealth nor their estates, but for their hair. This is not a well-known policy. You won't find it on the grand list of Mughal revenue reforms, nor tucked beside the famous land surveys of Todar Mal under Akbar. And yet, the smaller ledgers, the ones kept in provincial courts, often scrawled in a mix of Persian and Braj entries appear with striking regularity. One widow veiled with full braid, unshorn. Levy, 3.5 dam monthly. Teen was called, unofficially, the Zulfikar, Orlog Levy, a tax on hair, but it was far more than a quirky fee. It was a deeply coded punishment, rooted in propriety, discipline, and a deeply uncomfortable anxiety that a woman who no longer belonged to a man might still possess beauty. And in the Mughal court, as in many courts, beauty, claimed by male lineage, was seen as disruptive, even dangerous. Widowhood in Mughal India was supposed to signal a kind of social withdrawal, a quiet retreat, a reduction of color, a perfume, of visibility. Women were expected to cease embellishment, to live on the periphery of family gatherings, to wear white, and, most significantly, they were supposed to cut their hair. It was not a law, but it was expected, encouraged, enforced through whisper and gaze. A widow who left her hair long, even if hidden under a veil, was seen as resisting this erasure, as clinging to life, or worse, to desire. And so, across certain provinces, particularly in Gujarat, Malwa, and parts of the Deccan, a bureaucratic workaround emerged. If a widow refused to cut her hair, the local kanungo, the revenue registrar, could add her to a special register, not of shame, officially, but of taxable deviation. The rationale was slippery and ever-changing. Some records cite sanitation, others cite the burden of combed hair on temple caretakers or communal washing spaces. But the deeper reason was always control. A woman's braid, particularly if scented or maintained, was seen not just as vanity, but as a threat to order. And so they taxed it. It wasn't a large amount, often just a few dumb copper coins, enough to feel symbolic, but not ruinous, enough to mark her, to say, "We see you." Widows who paid the tax were marked with a small stroke beside their names, a red ink line, like a fallen strand across the page. Those who refused, well, their stories are harder to trace. One record from Surat mentions a woman named Janvi, widowed at 24. She refused the shearing ritual after her husband's death. Her in-laws brought the issue before the local mufti. The case was dismissed. But 3 months later, a new line appeared in the revenue book. Janvi bint Ramat, Full braid maintained. Tax initiated. She paid for 6 months. Then her name disappears. Historians aren't sure what happened. Perhaps she cut her hair. Perhaps she left the province. Or perhaps, like many women in the margins of empire, she simply vanished without a record. There are echoes of this practice across the Mughal territories, though never formalized in imperial edicts. It was always informal, always local, always quietly enforced by clerks who claimed they were merely following custom, and the cruelty lay not just in the tax, but in the assumptions behind it, that beauty was public, that it must be regulated, that a woman, once widowed, must cease to be seen, even beneath her veil. That hair, left long, was a refusal to mourn properly. Of course, this wasn't the only kind of widowhood in Mughal India. In royal courts, widows of emperors were often elevated, granted titles, estates, and political influence. Women like Nur Jahan, though not a widow when she wielded power, paved the way for others to remain in courtly life after their husbands' deaths. These imperial widows were often painted in full regalia, hair bound, eyes steady, still powerful, but they were exceptions, protected by lineage, proximity to power, and Persian courtly norms that made space for elite women, at least in theory. The average widow in the bazaar, in the village, she had no such protections. For her, the braid was both burden and defiance. It told the world she still tended herself, still remembered who she had been before loss, and in a society eager to turn her into a ghost. That was enough to make her suspect. Some widows found ways around the tax. In one district near Agra, ledgers show a sudden rise in temporary sharing. Fees, small bribes, paid to record a haircut that never happened. In other places, barbers were paid to fake the ritual, to snip only a lock, then wrap the remaining hair in tighter braids, hidden beneath thicker veils. These were not acts of rebellion in the traditional sense. They were acts of quiet preservation, of a self that still mattered, even in grief, of memory made tangible, one strand at a time. But questions remain. Why did the Mughal clerks care so deeply about something so intimate? Why did the act of not cutting one's hair in silence, in mourning, in private merit taxation? And what does it say about an empire when a widow's beauty became a line item in its budget? The deeper one looks into the administrative records of the Mughal Empire. The clearer it becomes that nothing escaped the eye of the scribe, not even the hidden grief of women, where the imperial farmans announced conquests and alliances. The real heart of the empire beat in district revenue books, where a widow's name could be quietly marked with a red dot and a clerk's curled script might determine whether she had mourned properly. The hair tax was never publicly debated. At court, no emperor, not even the meticulous Shah Jahan, who tallied every marble slab of the Taj Mahal, is known to have uttered a word about it. But in the provinces, under the eyes of local governors, the practice became routine, particularly in times of economic stress. When crops failed or tax collection lagged, administrators looked for new sources of income. And in the margins of their ledgers, widows became revenue. It is hard to imagine now that a woman's private grief, hidden beneath a veil, could be audited. But in the Mughal fiscal imagination, everything was measurable. Even mourning in the temple towns of central India, Ujjain, Maheshwar, and Burhanpur, widows were often part of ritual service communities. They cleaned shrines, prepared food offerings, and lit lamps. Many remained in their husbands' households, dependent on in-laws. Others lived together in quiet, often ignored compounds near temple tanks. For these women, keeping their braid intact was both a comfort and a risk, because there were whispered beliefs, especially among Brahmin families, that a widow's uncut hair could cause misfortune, that it kept the spirit of her husband from fully departing, that it called attention from wondering eyes. Men who believed a still beautiful widow might be persuaded into secret unions, or worse, be accused of provoking desire simply by existing. So, the tax became a tool, not just of punishment, but of warning. Records from the district of Darsho said barbers who refused to perform the ceremonial cutting of a widow's hair could be fined under local ordinances. Not Mughal law, per se, but customary enforcement, social rules, transcribed into fiscal consequence. One haunting entry reads, Barber Suwa Ram refused to cut the locks of Uma, widow of Sitaram, citing prior debt. Fined 1 dam for disrespect to duty. The debt was never explained, but the implication was clear. Even the cutter was under scrutiny. And yet, this wasn't uniform cruelty. In some places, governors quietly suspended the tax. In Kashmir, under the liberal policies of Ali Mardan Khan, no widow's tax appears in the ledgers from 1642 to 1647. One letter preserved in the Bahu Fort archives mentions a courtier named Fatima who intervened in tax disputes on behalf of mourning women, arguing that grief is not a commodity for court revenue. She was ignored, but the letter survives, and in cities like Lahore and Delhi, cosmopolitan centers, where Persian culture often elevated elite women to visible positions, the tax was inconsistently applied, if at all. But in the borderlands, where officials had wide discretion and little oversight, the story was different. There, the braid became not just a target, but a currency. We have reports, not many, but enough, of barbers being instructed to collect locks of hair from widows who could not pay. These were not mutilations, but symbolic acts. A single strand, or a small tuft, cut and handed to the registrar. In some districts, they were sealed in wax packets and filed, to prove, it was said, that the tax had been accounted. No scholar knows what became of these sealed hairs. Most likely, they were discarded when ledgers were updated. But the idea lingers that a widow's body, even in mourning, was not her own. That grief could be measured, priced, and filed away in the fiscal bureaucracy of empire. Yet, despite this pressure, some women refused. A story comes from Baroda, where a widow named Liwant, aged 37, refused to cut her braid after her husband's death. Her neighbors protested. The local registrar, unsure how to proceed, recorded her as non-compliant, but did not enforce the tax. 2 years later, she opened a small school for orphan girls, funded by embroidery commissions. Her name appears in no temple records, no court judgments, but in a ledger from 1673, her entry reads simply, Widow Lawante, braid maintained, tax waived, community silent. It is the last known mention of her. And then there is Parvi, a woman from Bhuj, who wrote a formal petition to the Subedar provincial governor, arguing that the tax violated both Quranic injunctions on compassion and her late husband's will, which explicitly stated she should not be shorn. Her petition, written in Persian, remarkably fluent, ends with this line, If my grief must be weighed, then weigh it truly. Weigh the nights I have not slept, weigh the days I have not spoken, but do not weigh my hair. That was his last memory. Her petition was denied, but the court clerk added a note, Widow educated, petition preserved for review. These small footnotes tell a larger story, that beneath the surface of empire, beneath the triumphs of conquest, the elegance of miniature paintings, the architecture of marble domes, lay a quieter world, a world of grieving women, watchful scribes, and braids that refused to be cut. And through it all, one question echoed without answer. Can dignity be measured in coins? Asterisk. By the final decades of the 17th century, the Mughal Empire was nearing its height in territory stretching from the mountains of Kashmir to the deltas of Bengal, from the sands of Sindh to the temples of Madurai. It was an empire of perfection on paper, a realm of order, catalogue, and classification. But no matter how many armies marched or palaces gleamed, it could not legislate one thing, what it meant to mourn with dignity. The Zulf Kar. The informal tax on the widow's uncut hair remained in place across many provinces, never formalized, never abolished. It lived in margins, annotations, and side notes of dusty registers. In some cities, it faded quietly. In others, it sharpened, not just as an economic burden, but as a moral indictment, because by then, mourning itself had become performative. The Mughal court had absorbed Persian rituals of grief, which prized elegance even in sorrow. Widows in elite circles sometimes wore mourning robes stitched with silver thread. Their hair was hidden beneath silk, yes, but the perfume lingered. They did not cut their hair unless tradition absolutely required it. Instead, they created new customs. They tied braids with thin strings of jasmine, folded locks inside veils. They mourned in poetry and posture, not in public erasure, but in the countryside. The rules were different. If a widow refused to share the registrar, might quietly add her to the deviant tax list. If she cried too loudly, she might be called unruly. If she lived alone, she risked gossip. And if she dared to remarry, even years later, that decision might be interpreted as proof that her mourning had never been sincere. And so, many women remained half visible, half counted, and wholly controlled. One such woman, from a market town in Bundelkhand, appears in the records as widow Satija, of narrow alley by the grain square, braided, alone. Her name is followed by 6 years of tax payments for non-compliance with rights. Then, a curious entry, declared mute. Tax suspended. It is unclear if she had always been mute, or if she had gone silent by choice. Perhaps she refused to answer further inquiries. Perhaps she withdrew into stillness, hoping that if she offered nothing, not sound, not hair, not grief, the empire would finally leave her alone. But the record kept her anyway. Another widow, named Racina, is listed in the 1684 registers of Berhampur as intermittent. Her braid was sometimes cut, sometimes not. Her taxes fluctuated. The clerk included a note. Disorder of mind suspected. What kind of disorder? Depression? Resistance? Exhaustion? We don't know. But the administrative state had already made its judgment. Even grief, it seemed, had to follow a physical pattern. Yet, amidst all this, there were moments of quiet defiance. In the port of Camby, coastal winds carried the scent of spices, sweat, and seawater, and within that swirl, a group of widows formed a cooperative, earning coin through embroidery and cleaning services for the merchant docks. One ledger from 1690 lists them as a collective, house of women without men. No taxes collected. Informal protection by giant merchant guild. There is no mention of their hair. No mention of mourning. Just an acknowledgement that they existed, not as burdens, but as a unit of function. Elsewhere, the town of Jhansi, a widow named Ahalya found refuge in a family-run library. Her tax records vanish after 1692, but her name appears in a handwritten commentary on Kalidas's Meghaduta, which she is noted as scribe and corrector. A rare acknowledgement of presence, not pity. And so, even as the empire continued to weigh its subjects, some women found ways to move outside the scale. They formed bonds, shared shelter, paid each other's taxes in bundles, hid their braids beneath borrowed scarves, whispered strategies. But the braid, always the braid, remained central, because in Mughal India, a widow's uncut hair was not just hair, it was memory, it was rebellion. It was the last part of her body she could call her own. After everything else, her jewelry, her household, even her sleep, had been assigned a number. The British, when they arrived in later centuries, misunderstood this. They believed India's widow rituals were solely religious, that head shaving and white saris were signs of Hinduism's cruelty. they missed the quieter truth that these rituals had long since become tools of empire, adapted and enforced through bureaucratic ink. And so, the widow's braid lived on, not as beauty, but as burden. Not until the early 19th century did formal records begin to omit hair-based entries entirely. Colonial administrative reforms flattened grief into categories: landowner, laborer, dependent. The braid vanished from the page, but not from memory, because even today, in parts of rural India, a widow's decision to keep her hair long, loose, and oiled is still seen by some as defiance, a trace, perhaps, of a time when grief was not only a private sorrow, but a public negotiation. And maybe, in some small town, a clerk once held a quill over the name of a widow and wondered, is mourning something we can tax? Something we must finally let go? Asterisk, Venice, in the year 1571, was a city of mirrors and masks, of shadows moving across marble courtyards, of gondolas that slid through canals like whispered secrets, and of palazzos where loyalty could change with the tide. It was a city that prided itself on balance, not just of trade and treaties, but of appearances. And in this city, where every surface reflected something, one woman's hair became a matter of state security. Her name was Lucetta Marini, though it is unlikely that was the name she was born with. In the records of the Venetian Council of Ten, the Republic's secretive ruling body, she appears under several aliases. But always, she is marked by the same description: a woman of widow's dress, bearing long black veils and hair of improper length. Proper, in this case, meant not cut in grief. In Venice, widowhood was codified as both ritual and fashion. Proper widow wore black, not just in clothing, but in soul. Her sleeves narrowed, her collars rose, her shoes dulled. Her jewelry was limited to jetstones or pearls, if anything at all, and her hair, it was to be cut short, if not entirely shaved, beneath her headdress. This was no mere custom. It was expectation, monitored by both convent officials and state-appointed matrons, who enforced the morality of mourning. But Lucetta broke the mold. She appeared in Venice in late spring, veiled, quiet, and claiming to be the widow of a minor diplomat lost in the Ottoman Wars. She sat little. She mourned deeply, and yet she was noticed, not because she wept, but because her hair was too long. Venetian mourning veils were sheer enough that, in the right light, the shape beneath could still be seen in Lucetta's silhouette betrayed braids. Not shorn, not modest, styled, she began appearing at Mass in churches along the Grand Canal, first at Santa Maria del Giglio, then at San Moissac. Always veiled, always solitary, but never quite invisible. Her presence was measured, her steps slow, her glances deliberate. And then the rumors began. Some said she was a courtesan in disguise. Others believed she was a noblewoman hiding a scandal. But the most persistent rumor, the one that drew the attention of the Republic's intelligence agents, was that Lucetta was not a widow at all. She was a spy. You see, Venice in the late 16th century was not just a city of merchants. It was a crossroads of empire. The Ottoman fleet had just been dealt a massive blow at the Battle of Lepanto, and tensions were high. Embassies were watched. Letters were intercepted, and women, especially foreign widows, were scrutinized with the same suspicion as double agents. Why? Because widowhood granted a strange kind of freedom. A widow could live alone, travel with less supervision, enter and exit homes without a male escort. She could receive visitors without raising alarm. And if she wore her mourning clothes properly, no one would dare question her presence. But Lucetta's braids betrayed her. The Venetian sumptuary, patrols, moral inspectors who monitored dress and behavior reported her twice. First, for wearing mourning garb beyond the acceptable period without ecclesiastical confirmation. Second, for being seen purchasing hair oil and scented combs from an apothecary in the parish of San Pelon. This last act, though trivial on the surface, was treated as near treason, because a widow who tended her hair was either preparing for remarriage or hiding something. Lucetta was summoned, not to a public court, but to a quiet room in the Doge's palace. There, according to the minutes of the Council of 10, she was questioned for 3 hours. Her story changed under pressure. The name of her husband shifted, his post became less clear, her answers grew vague, but still, there was no proof, only a braid seen beneath a veil that should not have been there. The council scribes noted that she spoke in tones practiced, bearing the poise of one trained to dissemble. They suspected connections to the Ottoman consulate. Perhaps she carried letters. Perhaps she passed information through coded embroidery, a technique known to be used by agents who sewed secrets into hymns and veils. But no letters were found. No informants confirmed her identity. Only her hair remained, oiled, coiled, and pinned in a style just familiar enough to suggest training, not domesticity, not grief. The sentence was subtle, but final. Lucetta was relocated to the convent of Santa Zaccaria, a frequent resting place for women of ambiguous status. Officially, she went there to complete the period of mourning. Unofficially, she was being removed from the map. She stayed in that convent for 7 months. During that time, she wrote nothing. She received no visitors, kit, and then one morning, the records say, she vanished. No departure recorded. No body found. A notation in the convent log. The widow with the long braid, gone. Chamber empty. No hair left behind. That final line might have been symbolic, or perhaps literal. Either way, her disappearance prompted quiet changes. Venetian. Sumptuary codes were updated. Widowhood was redefined more strictly. A new ordinance required documentation of mourning, an affidavit signed by a parish priest specifying the nature of the death, the duration of mourning, and a record of haircutting. This document was to be kept on file for inspection. Hair, once a private sorrow, became a credential, and behind that change lay a single question that the Council of 10 never managed to answer. If a widow is not what she seems, her braid speaks louder than her words. Who or what is she hiding? Asterisk. The convent of Santa Zaccaria, where Lucetta was confined, was no ordinary prison. It was a cloister for the daughters and wives of Venice's elite, a sanctuary draped in incense and secrecy. Nuns of noble birth whispered psalms behind screens, and the stone corridors echoed with the sounds of slippers on cool marble and the soft rustling of veils. To the outside world, it was a place of prayer, but to Venice's rulers, it was also a place of containment. Many of the women who ended up within Santa Zaccaria's walls weren't there for piety. They were sent, gently and without fanfare, to fade, to be set aside from polite society without the scandal of trial or execution. And so, Lucetta was placed there, not because she had been proven guilty of espionage, because her presence unsettled the Republic. Her braid remained, even as her words ceased. Inside the convent, there were rules. Widows were expected to wear their hair bound tightly or cut short under the supervision of senior sisters. Any failure to comply risked ecclesiastical punishment. Yet, Lucetta, according to the abbess's notes, resisted. A curious document survives in the convent's own archive, a daily ledger in which the abbess tracked behavior of those in reflection. Under the entry for Lucetta, the same note appears 3 times in consecutive weeks. Refuses cutting, refuses explanation, prays alone, does not sleep. In Venice, the braid had always been metaphor and mirror, a symbol of submission, of purity, of sorrow. To keep it long after widowhood was an open question. To keep it long during widowhood was an accusation. There was more at stake than custom, because Lucetta's silence, her composure, and, above all, her refusal to conform, stirred not only suspicion, but fear. In a city that relied on visibility, her invisibility was an affront. And in a city that functions through control of the scene, clothing, status, decorum, a woman who masked herself with false mourning and silent elegance upended the whole equation. Even more unsettling, she wasn't alone. Reports began to surface in the weeks following her arrival at the convent. Women in mourning veils were spotted near foreign embassies. Widow silhouettes passed too frequently along certain quays. At twilight, one particularly unnerving case involved a letter intercepted by the Signor Della, not Venice's nighttime enforcers, containing phrases written in what was later revealed to be coded embroidery notation. The letter's author, unknown, but the ink smelled faintly of rose oil, the kind commonly used in hair treatment. Paranoia bloomed like algae in the canals. Asterisk, the Council of 10 reconvened. Not to retry Lucetta's case, for she had, in their words, entered silence, but to revise the state's understanding of mourning. A document was circulated, stamped with the Doge's seal, entitled, "On the Regulation of Widows' Appearance in the Interest of State Stability." It laid out precise definitions. Mourning was to last 16 months. Hair must be cut within 10 days of a husband's death. Women entering the city under the status of widow must present documentation from their parish or diocese. Any woman found maintaining adorned or scented hair while claiming widowhood would be considered suspect under the Republic's treason statutes. It was the first time personal grooming had been equated with political loyalty. Asterisk. In the years following Lucetta's disappearance, mourning houses were subject to increased inspection. Veils were checked, headdresses examined, braids, if discovered, were recorded, but not everyone complied. In the artisan quarters of Cannaregio, where lacemakers and dyers plied their trade, a quiet resistance formed. Widows who lived alone began weaving messages into their mourning cloth, not grand declarations, but small rebellions. A stitch of red among the black, a braid of thread, shaped like a lock of hair. It was rumored that some of these women had known Lucetta, that she had been part of a network, not of spies in the traditional sense, but of women who used mourning as camouflage, who moved through the city undisturbed, gathering information, passing along coded messages, and escaping notice, not through disguise, but through conformity sharpened into performance. Because what better cloak than widowhood? What better mask than grief? Keta, though gone from the convent, had left behind a trail of questions. Among them, one peculiar object found beneath her cot, a comb carved from bone with 10 notches across its back. Each notch was filled with a sliver of metal, arranged not for function, but for sound. When shaken, it produced a faint series of tones, too specific, too deliberate. Some speculate it was a tool of signaling. Others believe it was simply a personal relic. But the fact that the abbess recorded its confiscation in the convent, log, comb, with unknown purpose, destroyed, suggests they feared what it represented. Even decades later, Council of 10 would refer to her case obliquely, using the phrase una di nero e nodo, one of black and braid. Not a name, not a crime, just a silhouette. A reminder that in a city obsessed with visibility, the most dangerous thing you could be was unseen. And yet, in all the official documents, one thing was never answered. If she wasn't a widow, and she wasn't a spy, who was she? Asterisk. Venice was built on secrets. The city floated not just on wooden pylons beneath the water, but on unspoken deals, silent glances, and messages that moved faster than boats. And within this city of reflections, the image of Lucetta, the woman in black, veiled but not erased, never fully disappeared, though her name was stripped from the official logs by the end of the 16th century. Traces of her story survived, not in state decrees or noble archives, but in the corners of the Republic's understructure. Guild records, merchant ledgers, private letters. One letter is found in a chest belonging to a silk merchant near Rialto, and written in an unusually even hand, opens with a curious line. The widow with the long braid left nothing except a pattern. The letter goes on to describe a particular weave, a narrow trim made of tightly looped silk, lined with a hidden stitch in gold thread. The gold thread followed a pattern that, according to the merchant, read like a verse when touched. This was no romantic metaphor. This was literal. It's been suggested by modern historians that the pattern referred to a tactile code, a form of raised text encryption hidden in garments, possibly adapted from embroidery methods used by the blind. The fact that it's linked to Lucetta, or at least her legend, suggests she may have been part of something more deliberate, a network. It's not just of women, but of widows, real or false, loyal or independent. Women who understood that grief, when properly framed, granted them freedom. You see, the Republic had made a miscalculation in trying to control mourning by legislating the veil, the braid, the timeline. They had created a space that was simultaneously surveilled and protected. Widows could walk where unmarried women could not. They could dwell alone without suspicion. They could observe, and in Venice, observation was power. The braid, once the subject of moral scrutiny, became something else entirely, a signal, not always visible, but felt, worn longer than custom allowed. It might be a challenge, plaited in a way that defied the mourning cap, a message, coiled with a ribbon when none should be worn, a provocation. It was not just one woman's resistance. It was a quiet, collective theater, and Lucetta had been its most visible act. Back at the convent of Santa Zaccaria, where she vanished, an inventory taken 6 months later notes a missing item, one hair veil, thick, with interior lining, presumed discarded. That lining, according to the abbess's records, was padded more than necessary. It may have concealed something, a document, a tool, or simply the braid itself, removed, preserved, like a relic or warning. In the centuries that followed, Venice's obsession with regulating appearance only deepened. Mourning handbooks were published. Braid length was standardized for noble women. Even in private, the Council of Ten adopted new methods of domestic surveillance, but they never fully rid themselves of a widow's ghost. There are reports, occurring through the 17th century, of a woman matching Lucetta's profile, tall, silent, veiled in black, hair visible beneath sheer silk, appearing during times of unrest. During the plague riots of 1630, she is said to have stood at the edge of the crowd near the church of San Rocco, not shouting, just watching, during a scandal involving a cardinal's household in 1683. A similar figure was seen boarding a gondola after midnight, Kea, her braid unmistakable in the moonlight. These were dismissed as urban myth, folklore. Venice loved its ghosts, and yet the braid kept showing up, not just on heads, playing paintings. In one corner of a fresco in the Scuola dei Carmini, a mourning figure stands half hidden behind a pillar. Unlike the other widows depicted, hunched, gray, muted, this one is tall, alert. Her hand holds her veil aside. Her hair, braided and bound in dark ribbon, is fully visible. The painter never explained her inclusion. She remains there, centuries later, not erased, not celebrated, just present. And perhaps that is the point. Lucetta was not remembered because she shouted, or resisted, or confessed. She was remembered because she stayed visible without being seen, because she refused to vanish completely. Even when the city tried to make her disappear, her braid, too long, too adorned, too deliberate, was not just a symbol of mourning. It was a record of what she refused to give up, of what the state could not truly measure, of how a single woman's silence could echo across centuries. And even now, in the side streets of Venice, when the bells toll at dusk and the waters darken, Some say you can see her reflection, not in the canals, but in the gaps between rules, in the space where a woman's grief becomes her strength. Venice was built on secrets. The city floated not just on wooden pylons beneath the water, but on unspoken deals, silent glances, and messages that moved faster than boats. And within this city of reflections, the image of Lucetta, the woman in black, veiled but not erased, never fully disappeared, though her name was stripped from the official logs by the end of the 16th century. Traces of her story survived, not in state decrees or noble archives, but in the corners of the Republic's understructure, guild records, merchant ledgers, private letters. One letter is found in a chest belonging to a silk merchant near Rialto, and written in an unusually even hand, opens with a curious line. The widow with the long braid left nothing except a pattern. The letter goes on to describe a particular weave, a narrow trim made of tightly looped silk, lined with a hidden stitch in gold thread. The gold thread followed a pattern that, according to the merchant, read like a verse when touched. This was no romantic metaphor. This was literal. It's been suggested by modern historians that the pattern referred to a tactile code, a form of raised text encryption hidden in garments, possibly adapted from embroidery methods used by the blind. The fact that it's linked to Lucetta, or at least her legend, suggests she may have been part of something more deliberate, a network. It's not just of women, but of widows, real or false, loyal or independent. Women who understood that grief, when properly framed, granted them freedom. You see, the Republic had made a miscalculation in trying to control mourning by legislating the veil, the braid, the timeline. They had created a space that was simultaneously surveilled and protected. Widows could walk where unmarried women could not. They could dwell alone without suspicion. They could observe, and in Venice, observation was power. The braid, once the subject of moral scrutiny, became something else entirely, a signal, not always visible, but felt, worn longer than custom allowed. It might be a challenge, plaited in a way that defied the mourning cap, a message, coiled with a ribbon when none should be worn, a provocation. It was not just one woman's resistance. It was a quiet, collective theater. And Lucetta had been its most visible act. Back at the convent of Santa Zaccaria, where she vanished, an inventory taken 6 months later notes a missing item. One hair veil, thick, with interior lining, presumed discarded. That lining, according to the abbess's records, was padded more than necessary. It may have concealed something, a document, a tool, or simply the braid itself, removed, preserved, like a relic or a warning in the centuries that followed. Venice's obsession with regulating appearance only deepened. Mourning handbooks were published. Braid length was standardized for noble women, even in private. The Council of Ten adopted new methods of domestic surveillance, but they never fully rid themselves of the widow's ghost. There are reports recurring through the 17th century of a woman matching Lucetta's profile, tall, silent, veiled in black, hair visible beneath sheer silk, appearing during times of unrest. During the plague riots of 1630, she is said to have stood at the edge of the crowd near the church of San Rocco, not shouting, just watching, during a scandal involving a cardinal's household in 1683. A similar figure was seen boarding a gondola after midnight, her braid unmistakable in the moonlight. These were dismissed as urban myth, folklore. Venice loved its ghosts, and yet the braid kept showing up, not just on heads, but in paintings. In one corner of a fresco in the Scuola dei Carmini, a mourning figure stands half hidden behind a pillar. Unlike the other widows depicted, hunched, gray, muted, this one is tall, alert. Her hand holds her veil aside. Her hair, braided and bound in dark ribbon, is fully visible. The painter never explained her inclusion, but she remains there centuries later, not erased, not celebrated, just present. And perhaps that is the point. Lucetta was not remembered because she shouted, or resisted, or confessed. She was remembered because she stayed visible without being seen, because she refused to vanish completely, even when the city tried to make her disappear. Her braid, too long, too adorned, too deliberate, was not just a symbol of mourning, it was a record of what she refused to give up, of what the state could not truly measure. A single woman's silence could echo across centuries, and even now, in the side streets of Venice, when the bells toll at dusk and the waters darken, some say you can see her reflection, not in the canals, but in the gaps between rules, in the space where a woman's grief becomes her strength. Asterisk in the grand halls of the Alhambra, once adorned with the delicate filigree of Nasri tiles and echoing with the footsteps of Christian queens. There walked a woman history would not forget, though it tried to. Her name was Joanna of Castile, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, tease to a united Spain, mother to emperors, and yet she would be remembered not for her governance nor her diplomacy, but for her grief and for the hair she refused to cut. They called her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, but before the madness, before the name wrapped her life in whispers and restraint, there was a young woman with intelligence sharper than the crowns she would inherit, a mind tuned to theology and politics, and a braid that stretched down her back in gleaming chestnut coils, a symbol of royal discipline and deeply personal autonomy. It is said that when she first arrived at the Habsburg court in Flanders in 1496, her hair shocked the attendants, not for its length, but for its presence, unapologetically shown beneath a sheer veil, perfumed, braided tightly. She did not fidget. She did not demur, and from the moment she entered the court of her betrothed, Philip the Handsome, she was watched that the Habsburgs were precise about female appearances. Widows wore hoods that covered their brows. Wives were expected to wear coifs that muted femininity. Joanna, royal, Castilian, inflected with the fire of Granada's recent conquest, stood out, not because she defied court dress, but because she made it hers. Her marriage to Philip began, as so many political unions did, in spectacle. Behind the veils and gilded horses was a genuine attraction. Philip adored her at first, and Joanna, with a kind of fierce intensity that was both admired and feared, adored him back. But love, in royal courts, was rarely safe. And Joanna, it turned out, loved dangerously. She refused to bind her affection in decorum. She wore her hair loose at night, long during pregnancy, even braided it herself when her ladies tried to style it in Flanders fashion. She was known to appear in Philip's quarters without announcement, without veil, a breach of protocol, so minor it might have gone unnoticed had she not done it so often. And as Philip grew distracted by court intrigue, by other women, by whispers of her intensity, Joanna's visibility became a problem. Her hair became a mirror for her mind. Too long, too wild, too attached. In letters from the Flemish courtiers to Spain, they began to describe her not as queenly, but unruly. They said she combed her hair with too much care, that she insisted on tending to Philip's grooming herself, that she plucked the gray hairs from his beard as a sign of devotion, or, as some cruelly wrote, obsession. And then came the grief. Philip died suddenly in 1506, barely 28 years old. The cause? Fever, likely typhoid, though poison was rumored. Joanna's reaction was immediate and total. She refused to part from his body. She had it embalmed. Placed in a coffin, she demanded remain open as long as possible. And she did not cut her hair. It was the first sign to the royal court that something was wrong, because in Castilian mourning, royal widows were expected to trim their hair as a sign of surrender to God's will. It wasn't ceremonial, it was absolute. Joanna refused. She kept her braid. She unbound it at night, even during travel. When she journeyed across the plains of Castile with Philip's coffin, a journey that lasted months, witnesses reported her tending the casket by lantern light, her hair undone, her dress dark, her lips whispering psalms or fragments of skear, fragments of memory. And still not mad. Not yet, because if grief is a madness, then every widow walks its halls. But grief in Queens is rarely allowed to run its course. In Joanna's case, her hair became the evidence of instability. Spanish nobles, eager to reclaim control of the kingdom, cited her grooming as irregular. Foreign emissaries wrote of a woman who sleeps on stone, combs her hair by moonlight, and refuses to put her husband in the ground. She did, eventually, allow Philip's body to be entombed. But her behavior, shaped by sorrow, amplified by isolation, and observed through the lens of male suspicion, had already been judged, and once judged, became policy in 1509, under the direction of her father, Ferdinand of Aragon. Joanna was confined, not with charges, not with a sentence, with care, with concern, with the insistence that she needed protection from herself. They brought her to the royal palace of Tordesillas, not a palace in truth, but a fortress with locked chambers and barred windows. Her daughter, the young Infanta Catalina, was allowed to stay with her for company. Her hair, still long, still untouched, became a point of discussion in court updates. One such note from a court confessor reads, "Her Majesty refuses the shears. The braid remains. She speaks to the wall and combs her hair each morning with a silver brush. It is as though each strand holds him." Decades pass. Joanna remained confined through the rest of her life. She would outlive her father, outlive Philip's memory, even live to see her son, Charles, crowned Holy Roman Emperor. But she would never again walk free. Her rooms were kept neat, her meals regular, and her hair, still long, still bound, each day became both her act of resistance and her rope of remembrance. There are no paintings of Joanna in old age, no depictions of her final years, but there are descriptions. A woman seated in the light from a single window, fingers braided with thread and hair alike, humming quietly, comb always near. Was she mad? Or was her madness a mirror held up by those who needed her silence? And if madness can be measured by the refusal to forget, then what, truly, does it mean when a queen will not cut the hair that still remembers? Asterisk in the dim rooms of the palace of Tordesillas, where Joanna of Castile lived out nearly half a century of confinement. The walls whispered less of madness than of patience. The stone halls were wide and bare. The windows, barred but not sealed, opened to orchards she rarely walked through. Her footsteps were light, her speech quiet, and her routine unchanging. And yet, despite the stillness, one thing remained visible. Her braid, braided each morning, combed by her hand or by the maids who dared, wrapped not just in tradition, but in memory. Court reports, sent regularly to Charles V, her son, and now Emperor of half of Europe, read like accounts of a living relic. Each note offered proof that Joanna was still unfit, still mentally unsound. But over time, their tone grew uncertain, even reverent. She keeps her hair long still, despite all attempts to introduce clerical modesty. Key reaches her waist. When asked why, she replies, "It has never betrayed me." To understand why this braid mattered, one must understand what it meant for a queen to refuse to forget. Joanna's confinement was never solely about mental illness. It was about legitimacy. After Philip's death, her claim to Castile was clear, but her grief, raw, visible, and sustained, made her inconvenient. Her father, Ferdinand, wanted control. Later, her son, Charles, feared a resurgence of Castilian loyalists who might rally around the Queen Mother if she were ever released. So Joanna was documented into silence. Her sadness became diagnosis. Her devotion became delusion, and her hair became the evidence of disobedience. In the logic of Spanish courtly mourning, prolonged grooming implied refusal. The braid marked a woman as holding on, not just to vanity, but to memory, to autonomy, to love that had outlived its usefulness. There are reports, buried deep in correspondence from the Archbishop of Toledo, of attempts to force a shearing. One effort, in the spring of 1516, involved a nun who had been sent to persuade Joanna to take formal vows, renounce the throne, and allow her hair to be cut in accordance with monastic custom. The nun was turned away. The next day, a new note appeared in the abbess's ledger. Her Majesty wept not in refusal, but in pity. She said, "If they cut what remembers, they may forget me sooner." No further attempts were made, and so the braid remained. It was often described, not just by Spanish scribes, but by foreign envoys permitted limited access. A French observer in 1525 noted, with some awe, that the queen's hair gleamed like polished walnut wood in the light, heavy with oil, twined like a rope of commandment. Another, a Flemish courtier, described it as a banner she carries on her own back. She rarely left her chamber, but the presence of her hair became symbolic within Tordesillas and beyond, for the servants, for the local clergy, even for the Infanta Catalina, who lived with her until marriage. Joanna's grooming was not merely eccentric. It was anchoring. It's a ritual that defied diagnosis, a way to remain sovereign in the only court she had left, her own body. There are stories, unverified but persistent, that once, during a bout of fever, her caretakers believed she might die. A priest was summoned to perform last rites. When he approached, she is said to have reached for her braid, unwrapped it slowly, and whispered, "Tell them I still remember." She recovered. Outside the palace, her reputation was less consistent. In Castile, she remained the legitimate queen in name, though she signed no orders and issued no proclamations. In the Holy Roman Empire, Charles ruled on her behalf, invoking her name only when it suited the diplomacy of unity. But in the villages along the Duero River, old women passed on the tale of a queen who refused to let go of her husband, her throne, her braid. Even ballads were sung in hushed tones. One fragment survives in 17th century collections. In Tordesillas sits a queen, her hair as long as sorrow seen. She binds it once for love, once more for all they locked behind the door. Charles V, for all his grandeur, never dared to visit her often. When he did, it was quick, perfunctory. Reports say she asked after Philip, asked if his tomb remained clean, asked if her name still lived in the prayers of Castile. Charles offered no comfort, but neither did he take the braid. Toward the end of her life, Joanna grew quieter, not madder, simply older. Her vision dimmed, her steps slowed, but her daily grooming remained. Every morning, the maid would bring warm water, a cloth, a comb, and Joanna would sit upright, eyes closed, reciting prayers or poems from memory, fingers moving through the same locks she had tended for over 50 years. Todd, a strand was ever cut, not by force, not by grief, not by time. When she died in 1555, at 75 years old, her hair was still long, still rich with oil, still bound at the nape. The royal undertaker who prepared her for burial at Granada reportedly paused upon seeing it. She carried grief, not in silence, but in memory, he wrote, and it remembered her. Joanna was buried beside Philip, not by her choosing, but by decree. A reunion on paper, but her true memorial was in the stories passed down of a woman whose mind was questioned, whose throne was taken, but whose braid remained. A tangle of power, devotion, and refusal. And perhaps that is the question history leaves us. If madness, is the act of remembering too much than who truly is saying. Asterisk, by the time Joanna of Castile was laid to rest, the world had already moved on. Her son, Charles V, ruled over an empire that spanned continents. Her grandson, Philip II, would become one of the most powerful monarchs of early modern Europe. In Spain, no longer simply Castile and Aragon, but a force driven by silver fleets and crusading visions, had become a kingdom too large for memory. But within the marble tombs of Granada, where monarchs are sealed into the stillness of kings, in Spain, no longer are sealed into the stillness in Aragon, but a force driven by sil. In a Spain, where its worst driven by silver and canes, since Alana is LS, is it us and all, it's us, my ends, and us, one, and us, one, where one is as, 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 I, as, ag, eternity. Joanna's hair remained the last thing to go cold. No chronicler says it outright, but in several quiet corners of history, in side notes from embalmers, in the letters of curious monks, there are whispers that her hair was still long, that it had to be folded, that her final hours were spent in silence, clutching the comb they allowed her to keep until the end. They buried her next to Philip, as she had once begged for, not during the years of grief and unrest, but decades later, when time had reshaped her image from threat to relic. The tombstone gives no mention of her confinement, of her resistance, or of her most stubborn act of mourning, but the people remembered in the villages of Castile. Stories outlived edicts. They told of the queen who wouldn't cut her hair, how it trailed behind her like a royal cloak during those nighttime processions with Philip's coffin, of how it was said that the wind in Tordesillas changed direction when she unbounded near her window. Superstition, of course, but in a country where crowns sat uneasily on heads and faith was monitored by inquisitors, the notion that a woman's hair could outlast an empire felt oddly believable. What Joanna carried, and what she refused to surrender, wasn't just grief. 'Twas witness. Her braid bore a record of all that was denied to her: sovereignty, autonomy, even dignity. Her confinement was long, but never complete, 'cause through it, she preserved herself. Every morning she combed the part of her that no man, court, or cardinal could take. Her father had ruled in her name. Her son had reigned with her signature affixed like an afterthought. And yet, neither ever dared to formally depose her. They did not need to. History had already filed her away under a name that sounded more like a diagnosis than a title, La Loca. But in the private spaces of Spain, in convents and corners of the countryside, the braid told a different story. In the embroidery of cloistered nuns, one can sometimes find a recurring motif, a long, twisting line of chestnut silk threaded among lilies and crowns. Scholars have debated its meaning, whether it was merely decorative or symbolic, but many now believe it was a tribute to Joanna, to a queen not of armies or declarations, but of refusal. Even in art, she appears obliquely. A Flemish altarpiece, once believed to be a portrait of the Virgin Mary, was later reattributed by historians. The woman in the image wears a dark veil, but beneath it, a plait of hair slips over her shoulder. The expression is not serene. It is inward, measured, alive with something unsaid. And in the margin of a 17th century historian's notes, beside a summary of Joanna's life, a phrase is scratched hastily in Latin, mint captiva, non corde, et crinis testis, est, captive, in mind, not in heart. And the hairs, the witness. Even centuries later, the image of the braid endured in Spanish folk prayers whispered by widows. Joanna became a kind of patron saint of forgotten sorrow, the one who never remarried, who never stopped mourning, who reminded the world that to carry love beyond its expiration date is not madness, but memory. And so, while the courts debated her sanity, and theologians debated the line between grief and heresy, the truth remained coiled, strand by strand, in her hair. It was not just a relic of the past. It was resistance, statement, made without voice, without pen, without proclamation, in a time when widows were expected to disappear into convents, to become quiet vessels of piety and obedience. Joanna's braid was a scandal, not because it was beautiful, but because it was intentional, because it said, I am still here, I remember, and I will not be reshaped by the men who ruled through forgetting. When Charles V abdicated and retired to a monastery, it said he kept only a few mementos, among them a rosary, a portrait of Philip the Handsome, and, according to a servant's account, a ribbon bound around a small coil of hair. No label, no explanation, just a simple length of chestnut brown, wrapped and tied. Perhaps it was his mother's. Perhaps he carried it in guilt or reverence, or maybe it was a reminder of the one crown he never fully claimed, the living legacy of a woman whose throne was taken, whose memory remained, because, in the end, they called her mad, but she never let go, not of her grief, not of her mind, and not of the braid that bore it all. Asterisk, there's a silence in the Irish countryside that feels older than the land itself, a hush that clings to the hedgerows, weaves through peat smoke, and settles low around ruined stone chapels where moss has replaced memory. In these forgotten places, stories remain, not as folklore, but as residue. In one of the quietest, yet most persistent, is the story of what happened when a woman became a widow, long before England's laws crossed the sea, before the famine twisted the land, and even before the Norman lords began carving their keeps into Irish hillsides. There existed a custom so intimate, so ordinary, that it rarely made its way into records, and yet it shaped generations of mourning women. It was known not by a single name, but by many. Girad, gruage, the cutting of the crown, the widow's severance. It was not ceremonial in the way church rites were, nor sanctioned by priest or druid in any formal sense. It was more felt than declared, a moment that took place between the burial and the returning, between the grave and the kitchen hearth. Asterisk, a woman's hair, in Gaelic Ireland, was not just a feature, it was an identity. Young girls wore it loose until their marriage. Brides had their hair braided and blessed before the handfasting, and wives, particularly those of status, wrapped their hair in linen coils, keeping it tucked away, not only for modesty, but for power. The longer the braid, the stronger the household. A widow, therefore, was not simply losing a husband. She was surrendering a kind of authority, and to show it, she was expected to cut her hair. Asterisk. Not with vanity, not for reinvention, but with solemnity, clean, unsparing gesture. It's often performed alone, or with the help of an elder woman in the early morning after the funeral. Sometimes a priest was nearby, sometimes not. Always. Hair was kept. Some buried it. Others placed it beneath a stone by the hearth. A few, according to whispers that drifted through convent walls and family tales, tied it into cords and wore it secretly in pockets sewn into their skirts, because, even as they obeyed the ritual, they grieved the loss of the braid as much as the man in the West, in Connaught and along the Galway coast. The widow's haircut became so expected that its absence was taken as a kind of unspoken rebellion. One record, a church ledger from 1671, notes a woman named Mayred ni Shinachin, who refused the cut after her husband's death. The entry is brief. Widow seen at chapel. Hairbound. No severance. Reproach delivered. No confession accepted. Number. Confession. Spiritual punishment for what was essentially a hairstyle. And yet, Mayred's decision was not isolated across the 17th and 18th centuries. Particularly during times of famine and conflict, more women quietly held onto their hair, sometimes out of grief, other times out of defiance. Because in a land where property was passed through male lines, where a widow might lose her home to a brother-in-law or be sent to live with distant kin, the braid became one of the only things she still owned. But tradition was hard to shake in Gaelic poetry. The widow was often described as Sin Girtha, of the cut head. This wasn't an insult, it was an image, a marker of respect, a way of saying, this woman has suffered, and now walks with the visible mark of sorrow. One fragment from a 15th century lament reads, she stood at the edge of the well, his hair falling like silence, till the braid was gone, and the wind no longer called her wife. In this, there is no drama, only submission. The understanding that hair was not for beauty, but for placement. To keep it was to resist your new position. Even the Brehon laws, those ancient Irish codes that governed honor and land, made mention of widowhood through the lens of visibility. While they never mandated the cutting of hair outright, they outlined mourning behaviors that heavily implied it. A widow was not to be seen in celebration, not to wear her household braid, not to enter contracts unless her mourning was deemed complete. And when exactly was mourning complete? The law did not say. So the braid became a kind of clock, unwound when the grief began, cut when it was unbearable, hidden when it needed to be softened. Some women, especially those of learned families, began tying pieces of their braid to their children's cribs, believing it protected the child from forgetting his father's voice. And still, no one wrote these customs down, not officially. They moved through generations like breath. Later, when English common law displaced the Brehon codes, the haircutting fell further into the shadows, but it didn't vanish. Instead, it shifted. Women in 19th century Ireland were still expected to withdraw into black after their husbands died. But now, black lace replaced the braid. Mourning bonnets replaced veils. The scissors still made their appearance, not in public, but by the fire. In the hush between the wake and the first sleep. One story, collected by folklorists in the 1930s, tells of a widow in County Clare who cut her hair and placed it inside the hollow of a tree near the sea. When asked why, she said only, it had to go where the grief couldn't follow. The tree is still there. It's hollow, overgrown, empty, or perhaps not, because the truth is, these widow's braids, these quiet, severed crowns, are still woven into Irish earth, not as relics, not as resistance, but as witness to sorrow that never learned the language of courts. Two women who marked the end of love, not with words, but with blades. To a country where even the wind seems to carry memory, strand by strand. Asterisk there was a time in Ireland when grief was measured in lengths of veils, of silence, and of hair. The cutting of a widow's braid was not merely symbolic. It was understood to be necessary. To let the hair remain uncut and perfumed was to tempt the past. It was to risk the dead returning, not as spirits exactly, but as unsettled memory, pulling the mourner back into a role no longer hers. But the strange thing is, the pact of cutting did not always sever in rural Munster, particularly around Limerick and Kerry. It was common for widows to keep the severed braid tucked away, not worn, not displayed, folded into cloth and placed in the eaves of the home or behind hearthstones. It was said that a part of the woman's married life remained in the hair, and that hiding it close would keep the warmth of the household from vanishing entirely. Some claimed that if the hair was burned, a widow would forget her husband's face, so most did not burn it. Others buried it deep in soft earth beneath an ash tree, murmuring short blessings of protection as they pressed it into the soil. One such blessing, passed down in oral tradition and only scribbled into a prayer book in the 18th century, reads, "Let no hand take him from me, but let the earth take this." The act was quiet. There was no congregation, no clerical authority, just the widow, the shears, and a deep breath that no one else heard. Often, the cutting was performed at dawn, when the sky was still blue with mist and the hearth had not yet been lit. The braid, sometimes dry, sometimes damp from tears, was held for a moment, then wrapped and hidden, but the absence, it, left behind, was visible. A widow with short hair was marked unmistakably. Her neighbors would lower their voices as she passed. Children were told not to stare. In church, she sat at the edge of the pew. She kept to the shadows. And when she went to sleep, her hands sometimes reached out of habit for a braid that was no longer there. The cut was supposed to help her move on, but for many women, it froze them in place in the oral archives collected during the 1930s by the Irish Folklore Commission. There is a description of a woman named Bridie Y. Howda, widowed, young, and living alone near Castle Island. The local priest noted that she cut her hair, as expected, but never covered her head afterward. She walked bareheaded in all weathers, her scalp pink in winter, browned in summer. When asked why she didn't wear a bonnet, she replied, "I've already lost the part that needed covering." Not all priests approved by the 18th century. With English ecclesiastical influence growing, the church began to formalize grief. Mourning periods were defined. The wearing of black was enforced, but nowhere in those regulations was hair ever officially mentioned. Still, scissors remained. Women continued to cut, not because the bishop said so, but because their mothers and grandmothers had, because the land still whispered its own expectations, because silence had weight, and tradition had hands stronger than law, and not all women resisted it. Some found comfort in the simplicity of the act, in the clarity it offered. In a world where grief was a long fog, the sharpness of a braid slipping from the scalp gave them a starting point, a line in the peat to step across. A widow named Soraha Ni Brianane from a village near Bantry Bay described it this way to a traveling nurse in 1892. The hair went, and with it, the voice I'd been holding in. I didn't wail till then. Grief, for her, didn't begin at the funeral. It began with the shears, and yet some women refused. In the increasingly nationalist communities of the 19th century, those who resisted both English control and imposed piety, the old customs began to shift. Care became a site of subtle rebellion. A few widows began to let it grow. Not long, not flamboyant, but enough to be seen. These women were whispered about, admired by some, condemned by others. Their refusal to cut was taken as a refusal to surrender, not just to death, but to the systems that demanded grief must look like absence. In 1865, a widow named Moira Ni Chathasai was fined by a local estate agent for inappropriate mourning dress after she appeared at a rent collection in a red scarf and her hair tied back in a visible braid. She paid the fine in coins she had sewn into the hem of her shawl and, according to an observer, said, "If they tax my hair, they can bury me next." No further fines were recorded. These women, the ones who kept their hair, were not always praised. They were often isolated, but they quietly shifted the practice. By the early 20th century, while the rural traditions of haircutting persisted, it became less universal. Widows began to choose for themselves. Some cut in private, others did not. The land no longer spoke with one voice, but the echoes remained, even today, on on certain headstones in old graveyards in County Clare and Kerry. One can find symbols carved low on the stone, a sheaf of hair bound in a knot lying beneath a chalice, or a carved shamrock. Some believe these are marks left by the women who buried their braids beneath the stones. Others say they're just decorative flourishes. But the older locals nod and say that was her crown, the one she cut, the one she chose not to, the one she buried beside him, not because she had to, because it was hers to give. And maybe that's the quiet revolution. Not the keeping of the braid, not the cutting of it, but the choice to decide what it meant. Asterisk. By the 20th century, Ireland had changed on maps, in churches, in cities. But in the countryside, along the hills and peatlands, the winds still carried older rhythms. And in many homes, the ritual of mourning remained intimate and physical. The wake was still held in the front room. The mirrors were still covered, and somewhere between the final prayers and the first meal without him, a widow would still sit quietly, scissors in hand. Yet something had shifted. The old belief that cutting the hair was essential to completing grief began to loosen. What once felt like obligation became decision, and that decision carried its own weight. In County Mayo, a widow named Nora Niskjola Eastbeg kept her long hair well into her 70s. Despite having lost her husband in 1917, she never remarried, never wore bright colors, but she also never touched the braid she had worn since girlhood. Her neighbors didn't gossip. They called her the mourner who waited. Her great-granddaughter would later describe how Nora kept the comb her husband had carved for her, made from ash wood, worn smooth by decades of use, and how she placed it on the table each night before bed. Not as ritual, as memory, because that's what the hair had become now. Memory with texture, no longer something to erase, but something to carry. The Irish Free State had no interest in regulating grief, but the church still maintained a quiet authority over mourning. Priests in rural parishes often encouraged widows to cut their hair and adopt the black bonnet, especially in the years after independence, when traditional Catholic norms grew stronger in daily life. But not every woman complied. A letter archived in a convent near Kilkenny records an exchange between a young priest and an elderly widow who refused to cut her hair even after 2 years of mourning. The priest wrote, "She grieves improperly." The abbess, in a rare note of disagreement, responded, "Perhaps she grieves more deeply than you know." The braid is not the sin. That braid, now mostly hidden, rarely commented on, became a kind of quiet rebellion, especially among women who had already been told, too often, to erase themselves in Dublin. In the 1940s, a photographer captured a widow named Mare Clancy outside a tenement building, her scarf slipping slightly in the breeze to reveal silver hair braided down her back. When the photograph was later exhibited, viewers were struck not by her face, but by the braid, the suggestion of continuity in a city trying to modernize. Some critics called it nostalgic. Others called it defiant. And slowly, the story of the widow's braid became folklore, not in children's storybooks or school lessons, but in whispered remembrances. In family conversations that began with, "Do you remember how she kept her hair after he died?" And in these remembrances, the tone had changed. It was no longer shameful. It was tender, because the cutting of hair had always been more than custom. It was language, one that marked time, not in days, but in emotions too heavy for words. And by choosing to keep her hair, a widow didn't deny grief. She carried it differently. In Donegal, one widow reportedly carried her husband's braid instead. After his death from tuberculosis, she cut a lock from him, not herself, and kept it bound in linen in the folds of her prayer book. She refused to cut her own. She wore it, not for vanity, but because, as she once said, it was braided on our wedding morning. "I want to wear what he last touched." Her neighbors respected it. By the 1970s, the visible ritual of haircutting had mostly faded. Mourning became quieter. less defined by clothing, less dictated by clergy. Key. But even so, some women still chose to cut the braid, even if no one expected it anymore. Why? Perhaps for closure. Perhaps because it felt like part of the farewell. Or perhaps because they remembered their mothers doing it, and their grandmothers before them. In the town of Ennis, a retired schoolteacher named Eileen O'Dalla gave a recorded interview in 1982, speaking of her mother, who cut her hair in a single, quiet motion after her husband drowned in a storm. She didn't cry at the wake, Eileen said. She didn't faint or shout, "Kuh," but she went into the kitchen after they closed the coffin, and we heard the snip. And after that, she just sat at the table, like the rest of her had gone with it. Okay. That's the shape grief took in those days. Not always loud. Sometimes it was just the sound of shears and the creak of a chair. Today, there are only traces left, photographs, yellowed and fading, where widows sit in stiff-backed chairs, hands in laps, braids tucked beneath black shawls, stone cottages where a single comb still hangs on the wall above the hearth, wood darkened by age and heat, and stories, small ones, of women who kept the braid, or cut it, or did both at different times, because mourning isn't linear. It frays and reknots, like hair. The laws never demanded the cut, but the land expected it. And for a long time, so did the women themselves. But now, when asked, many can't remember the last time they saw someone do it. The scissors stay in drawers. Hair grows gray. The silence remains, but the ritual has moved inward. So perhaps the question isn't whether the braid was kept or cut, but what it held. And how many women, across centuries of stone, fog, and salt, tucked their sorrow into it, until it became part of who they were. Asterisk in the shogunate cities of Edo period Japan, where sandals padded softly along gravel paths, where the cherry blossoms felt like forgotten vows, and where silence was often more dangerous than speech. There existed a particular hairstyle that could turn heads, stall conversations, and, at times, even stop a samurai in his tracks. It was not the elaborate coiffure of a geisha, nor the shaped crown of a monk. It was the simple, somber knot of a widow. At first glance, it was unremarkable. Single bun tied low at the back of the head, unadorned by combs, pins, or silk. No lacquer, no perfume, no bright threads. Tacit plainness was what gave it power, because to wear it was to make a public statement. I have lost, I have mourned, and I am no longer under a man's control. The hairstyle had a name, Suyamaj. The glossless chignon was seen on older women, especially widows, and it followed a set of rigid conventions. The hair was brushed back with care, gathered without style, and secured in a knot that faced downward, a gesture of humility, and in some eyes, warning. In the rigid hierarchy of Tokugawa Japan, everything had a place, including grief. Widows were expected to withdraw from public life, especially if they were of the samurai class. If their husbands had died in battle or by seppuku, their duty was to remain quietly loyal, to live modestly, to raise their children with restraint and discipline. And many did, but some did not fade away. Some were the kosu mage with a posture. That said, this knot does not represent defeat. It represents freedom. It was this quiet inversion that unsettled many in a warrior society where a man's reputation depended on loyalty, obedience, and control over his household. A woman who no longer bowed to patriarchal rule, yet maintained perfect composure, posed a subtle challenge, and the challenge was made more unnerving by its restraint. No accusations, no tantrums, just a tight, quiet bunt that announced, I remain. There is a record, kept in the private journals of a Kyoto retainer, of a widow named Shino, whose husband had died in a failed uprising against the Tokugawa regime. Rather than disappear into obscurity, Shino took over her husband's duties, managing the estate's tenants, handling grain contracts, and continuing her husband's monthly tea gatherings with senior samurai. She wore the koyamage, never changed it, and refused all offers of remarriage. The retainer notes, she spoke little, served tea exactly as tradition required. But when she entered the room, the younger men stiffened. They did not know whether to bow or draw back. Her hair was a wall. Shino was not unique in the inner quarters of Edo and Osaka. Many widows of high-ranking warriors quietly assumed the roles their husbands had left behind. They acted as guardians of memory, not just family honor, but strategic knowledge. They remembered who had aligned with who had broken protocol, who owed favors. And they carried that knowledge not in scrolls or ledgers, but in posture, in presence, in a tightly wound, not at the back of the head. Samurai, for all their training, understood symbols. They read silences the way others read maps. And so, when a widow appeared in court, veiled in etiquette, but not submission, with the suimage secured and unmoving, she was not just mourning. She was declaring position. There were even whispered sayings among lower-ranking retainers. Fear the blade of a grieving man, but fear more the silence of a widow's knot. The fear was not of violence, it was of influence, because, while women of samurai households were not allowed to hold public office, they shaped the political landscape in quieter ways. They arranged marriages. They maintained correspondence. They preserved alliances. And they taught the next generation of warriors boys who would one day wield blades, and girls who would wear knots of their own. One widow, Te of Sendai, was said to have taught her 3 sons to fight after their father's assassination. She never left the family estate. She wore the koyamage every day when her eldest son challenged a neighboring clan in court and won. Rumor spread that it was Te who had dictated the legal strategy and the court etiquette that trapped the rival lord into contradicting himself. Again, no proof, no scandal. It's just a mother in black with a quiet bun, who nodded once when the verdict was delivered. Even the aesthetics manuals of the time, those elegant woodblock prints that cataloged hairstyles and kimono patterns, often depicted the widows not with care. Though understated, the kuzo mage was drawn with exact lines. Its simplicity bordered with notes like worn after loss. A style that rejects vanity, not to be adorned without dishonor. But perhaps the most telling line appears in a forgotten etiquette guide, written not for nobles, but for merchants' wives. When the woman wears the widow's knot, do not ask when she will cut it off. It may no longer be mourning. It may now be her crown, 'cause some never took it down, even decades after their husbands had passed. Even long after children had grown and homes had changed, some women continued to wear the koyamage. It became not just a symbol of grief, but of identity. They were no longer wives, but they were not invisible. Their power was in what they remembered and what they no longer had to prove. And among the samurai, men trained to read threat. In every detail, there was a grudging respect, perhaps even fear, because to them, a sword could be blocked, but a memory wrapped neatly into a knot and carried without shame, that could undo a man before he even drew his blade. Among the countless things that could unnerve a samurai, an ill-placed silence, an insult veiled in politeness, a glance that lingered too long. None carried as much quiet authority as the widow's bun worn in still defiance. It was not a threat, not directly, but it was a reminder in the highly formal world of Tokugawa Japan, where hierarchy was everything and emotion had a season. The koyamage, or widow's shinyan, became more than mourning. It became a kind of coded presence, a way for a woman to move through courts and ceremonies, tea gatherings, and family disputes. Not as a mourner, but as a keeper of unspoken knowledge. Her husband might be gone, but his alliances, his grudges, his debts, they were all still living inside her memory. And that memory sat bundled neatly at the nape of her neck. One particular case, recorded in the archives of the Date clan in northern Japan, tells the story of Lady Eyes, the widow of a samurai who died defending his lord during a border conflict in 1639. After his death, she was invited politely, but with clear expectation, to retire to a Buddhist convent. It was a common practice, a gesture that allowed widows to live quietly, detached from the complexities of clan politics. Lady Eyes declined. She remained in her home on the outer edge of the estate, raised her son, kept her appointments with the steward of the household, and, most notably, never changed her hairstyle. Witnesses describe her hair as always pinned in the koyamage, neat and modest. But what made her memorable wasn't the style itself. It was the way she moved through rooms. She bowed to no one below her station. She never lowered her gaze when male visitors entered. She rarely spoke, but when she did, men listened, because she remembered everything. She remembered who had stood behind her husband when the orders were given. She remembered which retainers hesitated. She remembered a gift of lacquerware delivered too late to be of use in the campaign, in the name of the one who sent it. And when her son came, obeyed and took his father's post, she advised him behind closed doors with a precision that made senior counselors uneasy. What power did she have? None, officially, but in samurai society, perception mattered more than decree. Lady Eyes' bun became a symbol within the clan, not just of laws, but of continuity. A generation of men had passed. Their swords now hung on walls, but her hair remained the same. Every day, pinned into place with the same wooden comb her husband had carved in his youth. Another story, preserved in an Edo period diary, tells of a widow named Okatsu, who had once been married to a chief falconer of the Tokugawa inner court. After his death, she vanished from records for several years, presumed to have returned to her family's village. Then, during a dispute over a land grant near Edo, Okatsu reappeared, uninvited, at the magistrate's hearing, wearing full mourning dress and the kozu shumage. She said nothing for hours. Only after testimony concluded did she rise and present a folded letter, written in her late husband's hand, outlining his knowledge of the disputed land's true boundary. She bowed, left the chamber, and was not seen again. The magistrate ruled in favor of the claim outlined in the letter, but a note was added to the judgment. The Lady Okatsu has fulfilled her vow. Her silence was not emptiness, but preservation. This is what the widow's bun came to represent. Not grief that faded, grief that became structured in kabuki theater. Soyamage was reserved for certain roles. The loyal widow, the silent mother, the woman who waits but does not beg. Audiences understood the symbol instantly. A woman who wore it was not looking to return to joy. She was guarding something. This was especially true in households without surviving sons. When a samurai died without a male heir, his widow could not inherit his title, but she could, and often did, protect his legacy. She maintained his shrine. She managed his debts. She ensured the servants remained employed and that the family name was spoken at the right festivals. And she wore the bun, not always as custom, sometimes as warning. A visiting scholar named Ton Shimura, writing in E10 Biling Sith, noted that in one Edo household, two widows, sisters-in-law, had argued over family inheritance. The elder Lady Yura was known for her strict observance of mourning, always keeping her two yo-maids exact. The younger, newly widowed, allowed her hair to grow loose after 1 year, adopting a softer style. Shimura wrote, when the younger woman spoke, she pleaded. When the elder spoke, the room quieted. Such is the power of a knot tied tightly. And the samurai, who prided themselves on discipline, understood this. A blade could be drawn in anger, but the widow's bun was drawn with intention. It could not be unsaid. It signaled, I remember everything, and I still have something to say. But what happens when the knot is taken down? That's the question samurai never liked to ask, because when a widow removed the bun, it usually meant she had made a decision to remarry, to enter the convent, or, more rarely, to abandon silence. Some did, but most did not. Most wore the bun until death and were buried with it still intact, their hair combed one final time, knotted by a daughter, a maid, or a priest. A last act of control, of memory, of reverence. And perhaps that's why it was feared, because a sword can cut, but a memory can remain sharp for a lifetime. Quietly coiled at the base of the skull, in Edo period Japan, the most enduring forms of power did not arrive loudly. They did not wear armor, ride into courts on horseback, or demand titles. They were slower, quieter, bound tightly, and often they moved through rooms wearing black, bowed slightly, and spoke only when no one else dared to. These were the widows, and their power, unrecorded, unacknowledged by rank, was rarely underestimated, especially if they wore the suimage, the widow's bun, long after custom required. Among the many preserved records of noble households, especially those held in the massive temple libraries and clan archives from the late 1600s onward, one pattern appears over and over again: the presence of a widow in the background of key decisions, not always with a name, not always with a role, just a phrase: "She was consulted," or "the lady made her view known," and almost every time, the context implies that this lady, this shadow behind the screen, was a widow who had kept her bun. Consider the case of Lady Hisa, a widow of the Mori clan, whose husband died during a minor rebellion in the 1680s. She was expected to retire to a Buddhist convent. Instead, she remained on the estate and adopted her late husband's two younger pages as wards. She trained them in writing, in etiquette, and in the records of past disputes. She wore the koyamage every day, never styled, never adjusted, simple, precise, when a legal challenge arose over an inheritance years later. It was these two boys, now men, who won the case on procedural grounds. Their knowledge, pulled directly from the house archives Lady Hisa had kept open and annotated long after anyone else cared to read them. The clan recognized the outcome, but never the woman behind it. The historian who recorded the event noted, the widow was not questioned. She simply appeared one morning with scrolls in hand, and the matter was no longer uncertain. In samurai households, such gestures were understood. She did not need to speak forcefully, for naught spoke for her. But the legacy of the widows' bun extended beyond court and land in the tea rooms of Kyoto, where the way of tea was practiced as both art and diplomacy. Widows were often the custodians of ritual. They preserved their husbands' teawares, their ink scrolls, their chosen blends of charcoal and incense. Some held tea gatherings, not for politics, but for remembrance, and it was in these gatherings that young warriors learned to observe, without words. The woman who poured the tea was not just a host, she was a living memory. One account from the 1720s describes a tea master in training who observed a widow serving tea during a memorial for her husband's teacher. Her hands did not shake. Her steps followed the old pattern. Her hair, pulled back into the suimage, caught the candlelight as she bowed. The student later wrote, "She did not teach me how to serve tea. She taught me how to endure." It's asterisk because that's what the widow's bun came to mean in its final form. Not just grief, not just memory, but durability.